This week we're talking about jihad in West Africa during the Age of Revolutions. And we have a particular reading assignment related to the life and times of Ali Asimi, which I want to talk about at the appropriate time. But first, let me explain what it means, the Age of Revolutions. This is the period in European and transatlantic American history more generally, and I mean American by all of the Americas, that's referred to as the Age of Revolution for a couple of reasons. One, because of the French Revolution, because of one then subsequently happened in the creation of Haiti as an independent country as a result of a slave uprising and other resistance in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is the western side of the island of Hispaniola. And second, it's called the Age of Revolutions because this is often considered to be the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is credited with really beginning in Britain. And from that dual dimension of revolution, both the industrial economic revolution and the implications of that economic revolution in terms of the attack on slavery and the political revolution that resulted in the overthrow of the French monarchy and the establishment of a revolutionary regime in France, and then the establishment of Napoleonic rule, and then the invasion of Napoleonic France throughout Europe all the way to Russia. And the subsequent reaction to that revolution when Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815, and there was a restoration of sorts of an attempt to reestablish the old regime, but continuing revolutionary change taking place in Europe all the way down to the middle of the 19th century. And so that the development of the United States as an independent country, the emergence of Haiti as the first successful slave revolt that led to the creation of an independent country, and the implications of the abolition movement where slavery was suddenly under attack, and then the spread of democratic rule or republican rule throughout Europe and elsewhere in the Americas, including the overthrow of most of the Spanish Empire and the establishment of the independent countries from Mexico all the way to Argentina and Chile. This is the Age of Revolutions. The problem with the concept is that it leaves Africa completely out of the picture. The only time that Africans are involved in the Age of Revolutions is if they are enslaved and taken across the Atlantic and become involved in a slave revolt or something in the Americas. And otherwise, Africa is not really included in this paradigm. And it's a paradigm that is extremely important in history. History and historians like to establish periods. They like to establish beginning and ending dates for particular phases of history. And hence the Age of Revolution has become something that historians use as a benchmark in terms of discussing a whole number of different phenomena. Historians attack it, they qualify it, they add new dimensions to it, they do all kinds of things, but nonetheless the Age of Revolutions is something that has become quite standard in the historiography especially, as I say, of Europe and of the Americas. And my point today is to shift the perspective quite a bit and talk about a movement within Africa that was corresponded in chronology virtually entirely to the age of revolutions, that is roughly from the 1780s through the middle of the 19th century. But in the African context, the movement and the event that was comparable was the Jihad movement in West Africa, which, as you will see, the chronology virtually overlaps. So a number of questions arise, needless to say. One, is there any connection between Jihad and the Eurocentric age of revolution? Two, what are some of the similarities and differences between these different historical events and processes? And three, what are the implications for understanding African history and indeed the broader history of the Atlantic world? So that's the point, is we're going to look at this Jihad movement. So the first point to really understand is, what is a jihad and what does that mean? And of course that has contemporary significance because of the so-called terrorist movement that relates to ISIS, relates to Boko Haram in Nigeria, relates to what's going on in Afghanistan, the Taliban, and so on. So that there is a contemporary significance to the concept of jihad, but what is often not recognized is its historical importance. And jihad, of course, means holy war, and it's a Muslim concept of holy war. The first jihad in the history of the Islamic world, and hence the first jihad, was the war, the uprising that resulted in the establishment of Islam itself, and therefore is related to the Prophet Muhammad, related to the Arabian Peninsula, and to what became an expansive war and spread of Islam as a religion throughout not only the Middle East, but all across North Africa, across Asia, all the way to the Philippines, and across Africa, all the way to the Senegal River Basin. So that original jihad, the jihad of the Prophet, had certain characteristics and certain rationalizations that are very important to understand, because all of the modern movements that are considered to be jihad have one very important feature in common, and that feature is they attempt to copy, they attempt to explain the current movement that's being called jihad in terms that relate specifically to the original jihad of the Prophet Muhammad, so that certain things have to happen and have to be present for there to be a jihad. This is argued and debated and written about in Arabic within the scholarship of Islam, going back to the Quran and going back to the Hadiths, or the various stories that were told about the Prophet Muhammad, the traditions around the Prophet Muhammad. All of this is cast in a particular mold that is identified as jihad. And these features include some of the following are examples of what jihad signifies. First of all, every jihad has to have a leader, In Islam, they have to have an imam. Now, imam is the person who calls people to prayer, and particularly the imam is the person who calls people to prayer on the main prayer on Friday that takes place after midday. And the imam, therefore, is considered to be the religious, the intellectual leader of the community of Muslims. And for any mosque, every mosque has to have an imam. But the imam that relates to the jihad is an imam of a much bigger and much wider community, not just a single mosque. But it's nonetheless, it's the same word, it's the same idea, it's the same sense of leadership that's both spiritual, it's intellectual, that's religious, and then in many contexts is actually political. It has a teaching function because an imam is, as all other clerics in Islam, is also always a teacher. So that there's a teaching component, there's a leadership component that's connected with the idea and the concept of imam. Another feature is that the people who are the followers of the jihad are recognized as a community, as a jama'ah, again in Arabic and in all the languages like Hausa and Swahili and other languages where Islam is dominant. There's a sense of a community which is again is religious, is political, is and more, so that the imam is the head of a community. So these concepts are central. Now you can have all of these things and not have a holy war, and that in fact is the point. They are common features of Islam, and they have nothing specifically to do with warfare or resistance or anything like that. But when there's a jihad, you have to have a leader. You have to have somebody who's recognized as the leader. So that's one feature that's in common. Another that also goes back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad is that jihad is always considered to be defensive, not offensive. People stage a jihad when they're forced to do it, and they have no other alternative. Now, we as historians can analyze and say, well, actually, there were other alternatives and it wasn't necessary. But the people who believe in the jihad have to believe that they are on the defensive and that they have no alternative but to fight back. So that's a dimension of jihad that is central to what happened in West Africa and indeed what is happening today. Another feature is that because it's defensive, the idea is that there has to be a hijrah. There has to be a withdrawal. In other words, because the community is threatened, the community withdraws from wherever it is into its own enclave to defend itself. In the historic case of the Prophet Muhammad, the withdrawal was from Mecca to Medina, which is why when people go on pilgrimage, they make that walk from Mecca to Medina as part of the pilgrimage. And that is called the hijrah, and that hijrah is also essential to any jihad. If you're on the defensive and you're forced to fight, it means that at one point you have to stage the withdrawal in trying to avoid the fight that becomes inevitable. And of course, what I'm really saying here is the most important dimension of this is what the people who are perpetrating a jihad believe. And they have to have the rationalization that they are doing the same thing that the Prophet Muhammad was forced to do. So these are some of the features. Another, of course, is that this is Muslim. That jihad is not just fought by anybody, and it's not fought for, material or monetary gain. It's fought because you believe in the religion of Islam, and you're forced into a position of having to protect yourself, protect the community, and indeed protect the religion. So there has to be the recognition that this is a Muslim phenomenon, and it's not. If anybody else joins this, they have to convert and have to become Muslims, or they're really not legitimately part of the movement. So these are some of the dimensions of what jihad means. Now, Islamic scholars from the time of Muhammad to the present, in fact, have argued and studied and written about the concept of jihad again and again and again. And in that discussion, that wider intellectual and religious discussion, and the extensive literature in Arabic on that subject, it's been made clear that in fact that there are three types of jihad. There isn't just a simple one jihad the way I've been describing it. There are three, and there are three types. And the jihad that involves violence and warfare is only one of those three. The three always have to take place, but the first jihad is the jihad of the of the what can be called the jihad of the head. You have to be willing to purge your mind, your intellect, of thoughts and deeds and beliefs that are not compatible with Islam. So that the first type of jihad is a personal phenomenon. It's a personal that has to take place inside each person as each person becomes, in a sense, purified, becomes completely moral, completely ethical, completely honest, completely all of the things that are extremely important in terms of an individual's character. And so that people can talk about jihad of the head, and they're not talking about killing anybody, or they're not talking about resistance of any type. They're talking about a personal, internal struggle with the temptations and so on of the world to reach a higher level of ethical being. The second jihad is also not anything to do with violence. It's not anything to do with warfare or killing or anything like that. And it's what can be called the jihad of the hand. It's that what you have to do once you've purged yourself of bad thoughts and evil ideas and so on, and really live a truly religious life, is the second thing you have to practice is not doing anything that violates the moral tenets of Islam, that you really must live up to being a Muslim who abides by the judgments of the imam, of the community, that is the right type of husband and father, who's the right type of neighbor. And so it's the jihad of the hand is a jihad related to action. That is how you behave and what you do. And so there's a lot of writing about those two dimensions of jihad, which have nothing to do with what the political and warfare that I'm about to describe, because it's only the third type of jihad, which is really the jihad of the sword. And that's when that's when Muslims feel they're put into a corner and they have nothing to do except resist, and the only way they can resist and protect themselves and the community is by fighting. And in the popular, normal sense, when we read about it in the newspaper and so on, and we read about ISIS or Boko Haram, or this is the dimension of jihad that we're referring to, is the violent the political, the overt, that goes beyond just your own behavior or your own thought, but into open warfare. And but it's important for us to recognize that when we talk about jihad, to recognize that Muslims talk about this in a much more complicated and sophisticated way than we do when we just talk about terrorism and terrorists. So, with that background, let's look a little bit at what happened historically in West Africa. The focal point is going to be from phase 2 on this chart you can see, which is the connected with the political state of Futa Jalon and with the state Futa Toro. And it's going to last right down, for my purposes today, after Al-Hajj Umar in 1837, and I would say really till about 1850. Although these phases actually don't completely stop. But the main focus of my talk today is really on the period from the 1770s through the 1850s. And it's in this phase, which is exactly chronologically, which coincides with the Age of Revolutions in Europe and in the Americas. But as we do when we talk about the Age of Revolutions, we're interested in the precedents. We're interested in the complications of analysis. We're interested in the conflicts that result in attempts to talk about something as a particular phase. And so too, in the case of the jihad movement in West Africa, in a certain sense, the jihad movement began well before the period of the Age of Revolution, just as a lot of the things that led up to the Age of Revolution are discussed in terms of France and Britain and so on. And the first conscious movement in relatively modern times to talk about a jihad, a political jihad that's going to overthrow states and establish new governments, dates back to the 1680s and the 1690s in the region along the Senegal River, in what's modern Senegal and in the area of what's now southern Mauritania. And the first individual was often credited with the inspiration of jihad was a man by the name of Malik Sy. And he actually staged a political military uprising against the establishment governments in the lower Senegal River Valley and overthrew several governments in the name of Islam, in the name of jihad, in the name of purification of society, in the name of eliminating bad government, corrupt government, and the establishment of a state that would use the Sharia, Islamic law, as the law of the land, and appoint judges and build mosques that would allow for a purified Islamic society. And Malik Sy actually, despite some initial successes, failed in his effort to do that. Nonetheless, he inspired many, many other people and leaders, and he was often referred back to later by other people as someone that was should be followed, should be copied, and who was an inspiration. So that's why we say that in many ways the beginnings of this date back to really the end of the 17th century. He failed, but subsequently and very shortly thereafter, there was a success because some of the people that had been his followers moved to an upper part of the Senegal River And they did establish a theocratic state. That is, a state that was based on the Sharia, that was based on the idea that had purified society. And that state was known as Fuda Bandhu, and that was the first of what I'm going to refer to as the states that were founded in Jihad in West Africa. A very small area on the upper Senegal River in what's now Senegal, the country. It continued to exist until it was conquered by the French in the 19th century, and it was an inspiration for many, many later movements. And there was the second one that followed that, which led to the establishment of another state called Fuda Jalon, started by Karamoko Alpha, who was the imam, who was the leader. And Fuda Jalon was established in the mountainous terrain of what's now the modern Republic of Guinea, Guinea Conakry. In which you'll see on a map in a minute. But he came to power in 1727 by attacking the existing governments that existed in the Fuda-Jalon, the highlands. And while there was problems over the next 50 years, it was a second phase of it that really began in about 1776, which you will note is coincidentally the same date as the beginning of the War of Independence that created the United States in North America, which is in many ways the beginning of the Age of Revolutions. And so that second phase was much, much more specifically and consciously dedicated to the concept of jihad and to the establishment of a political state based on the Sharia, based on the establishment of political leadership, and indeed the title of the king or the title of the head of the state was called al-Mami, which is a derivative from the word imam. And then there was a third one that happened in the Senegal Valley adjacent to the area where Fuda Bandhu is and where Malik Sai originally began, that led to the establishment of yet a third jihad state, still in a certain kind of way relatively small, but in part of the country of modern Senegal, centered along the Senegal River Valley under the leadership of Suleiman Baal. Which began in 1776, the same year that the second phase of the jihad began in Fuda Jalon. And as we'll see, and I'll concentrate more on here, is that then there was another one that began in 1804, and it is credited really with its beginnings in the period 1804-1808, that led to the creation of the Sokoto Caliphate under the leadership of Usman Dan Fodio. There was yet another one that led to the formation of the Caliphate of Hamdullahi that began in 1816-1817. There was yet another one that began in 1837 under the leadership of Al-Hajj Umar. These are all interrelated by this time. And it continued on after that. The last one that I'm referring to today was what is referred to as the Mahdiya, which erupted in a jihad in 1884 in the Nilotic Sudan, that is the modern country of Sudan, south of Egypt. And so this trend and acceptance of jihad therefore spans a period from the 1690s right up until, and indeed after, the conquest of West Africa by European powers, most especially France, Britain, and to a lesser extent, Germany. So that for the long 19th century, in a sense, from the end of the 18th century until the establishment of colonial rule, we can see that there's a wide territory that stretches from Senegal on the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Red Sea that experienced this movement where the revolutionary action, the political action, was all interpreted in terms of relating to jihad. So what does this mean today? Is that it makes you realize that the contemporary jihad is not something new in Islam, and it's specifically not something new in sub-Saharan Africa. So that there are two dimensions of this that are crucial to recognize. The first being that in terms of chronology, this is parallel to the Age of Revolutions, and second, that this movement and of jihad was very heavily focused in sub-Saharan Black Africa, not in the Middle East, not in other parts of the Islamic world. So those are dimensions. Now, in the West African context, there are some very specific features that stand out about this movement, this recognition of holy war, and this recognition of the political movement to establish politically autonomous states that recognize the Sharia as the legal course and protected the rights of Muslims and specifically promoted the construction of mosques, the building of schools, the dedication to Islam as not only a religion but a way of life, with the features, some of which might be considered relatively superficial. For example, they don't eat pork, you don't smoke, you don't drink alcohol, and these types of dedications. Increasingly, that women who are of marriageable age are not only married, but once they're married, they don't leave the home. They're in seclusion. The only time they leave the home is for particular events that are basically related to the life cycle. They don't leave the home except to go when a new baby is born, or when there's a marriage, or whether there's a funeral. But they don't go out and work. They don't work in the fields. They don't work in the marketplace. As long as, at least they don't until they're no longer of child rearing age. And this leads to a particular type of gender relationship, and leads to a whole series of things that can be thought of as being advocated and promoted very strongly because of the concept of jihad. So those are some of the features. Here's the area of West Africa that I'm first talking about. This is the Senegal and Gambia region, river region, and the highlands in this area here, which becomes Fouta Djallon, Fouta Toro is along here, Fouta Bondu is here, and so this is the area that we're talking about, which is the beginning of the jihad movement and where it was located. And what we're going to see happens is it's going to spread eastward. Indeed, it's going to spread eastward, as I've indicated, and so that by 1884, a century later, it spread all the way to the Red Sea. And all of the jihad leaders and all of these movements were fully aware of the other ones, and fully aware that they were all copying or replicating. I shouldn't use the word copy as if this is plagiarism or something. No, they were consciously recreating that original jihad of the Prophet Muhammad. in spreading Islam and consolidating Islam and in establishing a good government. Now, whether the government was good or not, we're going to see is problematic. Whether they were successful in achieving what they hoped they were doing and thought they were doing, again, is something that historians analyze. But there's no question that the nature of society changed. There's no question that the influence of Islam changed, and that the area, all the way from most of the area on the map that you see, became predominantly Muslim, or at least under Muslim government. So that is the revolutionary transformation of West Africa that I'm talking about, that is parallel to the Age of Revolutions. Now, as should be apparent, what is happening in terms of the concept of the Jihad movement is ideologically and in terms of people very different from the Age of Revolutions. That's why I'm talking about it as being something parallel to what happened in the Age of Revolutions. Not really influenced in a direct way. No one's copying what was going on in Europe. Quite the contrary, any more than anybody in Europe was copying what was going on in West Africa. Not at all. I'm not saying there aren't influences that go back and forth, because there were very clear influences and factors that we have to take into account. One of them is this, that one of the complaints of Muslims was the sale of slaves to Christians. Muslims and Muslim law and the writings of Muslim were not opposed to slavery, but they were opposed to the sale of Muslims to anybody. If you were born a free Muslim under Islamic law, you could not be enslaved for any reason, any more than other features of Islam. I mean, if you were a Muslim and you lived in a Muslim society, you did not practice human sacrifice. You did not do certain types of medicines. You did not, as I've indicated, smoke or eat pork. You didn't do a lot of things because they were prescribed. And so that one of the features of the Jihad movement was opposition to the fact that people were being sold to Europeans, to Christians on the Atlantic coast. So that inevitably what this meant is there was an opposition to the transatlantic slave trade. It does not mean that some Muslims weren't sold into slavery. We've already seen some, and we're going to see more. It does not mean that some Muslims didn't violate the law, because like in any society, the law was more or less violated or not, depended. There could be bribery or not, whether it was sanctioned or not. People didn't always behave the way they were supposed to, or thought they should, or thought that other people should. We're not saying that. It's much more of an ideological dimension, that ideologically people were opposed to the idea that anyone could be sold to a non-Muslim, not specifically Christian, to any non-Muslim. And so this led to a certain type of writing and a certain type of thinking, which it's important to understand, because one of the misunderstandings often is, we had slavery in the Americas and this was one type. We had slavery in Africa and that was completely different. Well, one of the differences was related to the religion of Islam. Here's the logic that is written about again and again. In the end, you can never really be sure that a person that's being sold in the marketplace wasn't born as a freeborn Muslim. You can't ever be 100% certain. And so therefore there's always the risk that if you're selling somebody as a slave, that you're doing something that's illegal and immoral. And, well, what's the best way to make sure that you're not doing something illegal or immoral? Never sell a slave to somebody who's not a Muslim. If you sell them to a Muslim, at least they have the possibility of at some point establishing that they were freeborn and they shouldn't be enslaved and therefore get their freedom. So it's an attitude more than a law or something, which is that the only way to really ultimately to protect a freeborn Muslim is to give the benefit of the doubt to the person. So that's why you don't want to sell to non-Muslims. And that kind of argument goes way back, hundreds and hundreds of years. One very important and very famous Muslim cleric and scholar and political leader by the name of al-Maghili in the 14th century, operating in the middle of the Sahara Desert, attacked Jewish communities and actually destroyed many, many Jewish communities in the Sahara because he charged that those Jewish merchants didn't care about this business about freeborn Muslims and that they were selling people who were Muslims. And therefore, the reaction was to destroy the Jewish communities and to ban Jewish merchants from buying and selling slaves. That way, they could never make a mistake, deliberate or not, of selling a freeborn Muslim. So al-Maghili actually led a purge of Jewish communities in the Sahara, basing his argument on the fact that the Jewish merchants didn't care about Islam or didn't care about whether they were selling somebody that was a Muslim. And one of the results of that, it did not end the presence of Jewish merchants and Jewish communities throughout the Islamic world. It didn't. But one of the things it did do is it made sure that Jewish communities were not involved in the slave trade at all. A similar type of logic was used in relation to the so-called Christian European trade. Is the only way to prevent any of the injustices was just not to sell slaves to Christian merchants. And it doesn't mean that some Muslim merchants or some merchants who were Muslims didn't violate that. But what it did mean, because of attitudes, because of laws, because of courts, and despite any bribery, despite any injustices that actually were happening anyway, what it did do is it meant there could never be a large-scale trade to Europeans on the coast because of the danger of the fact that there might be freeborn Muslims being sold to non-Muslims. So that's how there's an influence here. And what I would argue is that the Muslim areas of West Africa, including the areas that were subjected to the Jihad movement and resulted in the establishment of new governments that were dedicated to Islamic law and were dedicated to the reform of society along Islamic lines of thinking, was that this part of Africa was less involved in the transatlantic slave trade than areas that were not Muslim. And as a result, there were proportionately far fewer people that went to the Americas from the areas where Islam was dominant because of this factor. And the Jihad movement was a major reason why that came about, because every one of the jihads had as one of the reasons that justified the war, and remember I've said that you can't have a jihad unless you justify it, and unless you list the reasons why you are perpetrating a war and an uprising, and that you actually write about it, you post it, and you read it, and people are committed to that a vision that accepts that specific wrongs and evils are being perpetrated that are being corrected. And the sale of slaves to Christians was one of those reasons in every single one of these jihad movements. Now, there were others too. For example, there was also the justification of warfare and the fact that some people were not practicing Islam in a pure form and that were worshiping rocks and trees and thinking that there was more than one God, Allah, and were violating certain of those types of orthodox thought about Islam, and therefore it became legitimate to attack those people because they were not practicing Islam, or they were practicing it in a very impure fashion as perceived by the leaders who perpetuated the jihad movement. So that my argument here is that the jihad movement, parallel to the Age of Revolution, had an enormous impact on the shaping of West African history. And it also had an enormous impact on the definition of what we have come to call the Atlantic world. Up until now, or up until very recently, when the Atlantic world has been developed as a concept that includes the countries all around the Atlantic basin, that is Europe, the Americas, the Caribbean. But strangely, the Atlantic world has often not included Africa at all. It's as if the geographical fact that Africa is on the Atlantic and helps to shape the Atlantic geographically, just as the Americas do and just as Europe does. The land mass of Africa isn't part of that intercommunicating world, and therefore is something different. And in its worst and most racist form, it means Africa doesn't have a history, means that nothing happens in Africa, and the only time that individuals who are Africans become part of the Atlantic world is when they're enslaved and taken to the Americas. And once they're in the Americas, they're part of the Atlantic world. But the countries and the societies they come from were not part of that world. And I'm arguing that the Islamic areas of West Africa where the jihad movement occurred really helped to shape what we have come to know as the Atlantic world, because they consciously and deliberately tried their best to stay out of that Atlantic basin that was dominated from Europe. So that is so not only do you see a parallel chronologically, but you actually see that there's a big part of Africa that helped to shape the Atlantic world by its attempt to remain autonomous and outside that world, and focus much more on North Africa and the Middle East rather than transatlantic. So that you have those two very important distinctions. There's a third one that you're going to see as we go through this more, is there's a peculiar feature of the jihad movement. It was against the enslavement of people who could be sold to the Americas, and it was against the slave trade with Europeans and Christians. It did not mean it was against slavery. And one of the consequences of the jihad movement was the massive enslavement of people who were considered not to be Muslim, or who were considered to be people who were practicing Islam wrong or badly, all kinds of justification. But one of the results was the enslavement of millions of people on a scale that was as big, if not bigger, than the transatlantic migration of enslaved Africans to the Americas. So that is a shocking and dramatic reinterpretation of African history and global history, where you see the importance of Africans as slaves being taken to the uh, taken to the Americas, and you also see the enslavement of comparable numbers of people within Africa who never go to the Americas but stay within Africa. These are some slides that show you what Muslims look like in the late 18th century, 19th century. The types of cloth they wore, the what they were wearing around their necks in the form of what are referred to as amulets or charms. And what they are, they're little leather pouches, and inside the leather pouch there is some kind of phrase written in Arabic. It's thought that these are religious charms that are important for religious reasons and for psychological and all kinds of other reasons. And in some ways are no different from Catholics wearing a cross around their neck or other jewelry that are considered that are Christian. And you see how people are covering their heads. On the other hand, you see women in the background who don't have much clothing on at all. Other Muslims from the early 19th century who were in Ashanti, and as depicted by Joseph Dupuy, who was a British diplomat who went to Ashanti in about 1820. And again, you see the type of clothing and the type of even facial scarifications and so on that were characteristic of Muslims and Muslim society in West Africa. Here you see the fact that that despite the ban on selling of slaves to Christians, and specifically the ban on selling Muslims to Christian, you see the evidence of Muhammad Kabasa Ganugu, a picture of the book, the Kitab al-Salat, that he wrote in about 1818, 1819 in Jamaica, but revealing his extensive education and background. So there were definitely Muslims that slipped through the cracks, but my argument is really that in a certain monetary sense, West Africa and the Muslim areas of West Africa could have supplied many, many more enslaved people than they actually did. Many more. And indeed, I would argue that from a demographic perspective, all of the enslaved Africans that went to the Americas could have come from West Africa and from areas where Muslim rule was, but they didn't. And rather than all of them coming from the areas of Muslim rule, the numbers of the percentage that actually ended up in the Americas from these areas is about 5%, not 100%. So you see, in a global sense, these attitudes and laws and restrictions actually had a significant impact on the demography of the Americas, and therefore really did have a significant impact in terms of shaping what we mean by the Atlantic world. So in this map, which is a map of the region of what's Nigeria, Ghana, Niger, Cameroon, the interior, shows what the region looked like before the Jihad movement that hit it after 1804. Some of these states, the powerful ones of Ashanti and Oyo in the south, the states of the north had Muslim rulers and Muslim populations, but they were considered by the people who promoted jihad not to be pure governments, and to have a lot of corruption and to have a lot of injustice. And in the course of this map shows what the political boundaries looked like in about 1780. And not many years later, virtually all of these states except Ashanti has been destroyed or reduced greatly in size and incorporated integrated into a new state, which was a Muslim state, the Sokoto Caliphate. This document, which was written in 1813 in Tunisia, is a document that, in fact, justifies the enslavement of black Africans who had deviant religious views from Islam, and emphasizing that one of the features of justification for slavery in the Islamic world is that Muslims cannot be enslaved, but people who are not Muslims could be enslaved under certain conditions. And this was written by a man who actually came from Timbuktu, as his name Ahmed al-Timbuktawi suggests. He was in Tunisia, and so he was black sub-Saharan, but he was Muslim, and he had been on pilgrimage in Mecca, and when he came to Tunisia and he saw the enslaved black population there, he wrote a book saying these people should be slaves because they're practicing religious things that are just unacceptable for Muslims. And one of the features about this man and about all the jihad movement was there was another characteristic that was unique in many ways, because the emphasis on Islam was most important and on purification most important. However, there was also an ethnic dimension, because most of the leadership and all of the major leaders of these movements were ethnically Fulbe. In Nigeria, the term used to describe them is they're called Fulani, which is just a local pronunciation of Fulbe. And they were all ethnically related, speaking the same language, and all of them writing in Arabic. And this ethnic dimension is one of the characteristics of this jihad movement that makes it stand out. The second feature, and Ahmed al-Timbuktawi was an example too, is that all the type of Islam, the allegiance to Islam in West Africa, was entirely of a particular type that is somewhat different than the usual Sunni-Shia distinction that one sees when you look at the Middle East. And that the distinction is that all of the religious leaders in West Africa and therefore the jihad movement in West Africa was connected to specific religious brotherhoods that were mystical in their orientation. They believed in following the leadership of founders of these particular brotherhoods, and they often called themselves as a brotherhood after the name of the founder. They are, in Islam, they're referred to as Sufi. They were Sufi, which meant mystical, and the dominant brotherhood for all the early jihads from the late 17th century right through the Sokoto one was that all of the leaders and all of the principal followers of these were a member of the Qadiriya Brotherhood, and they were ultimately followed the leadership of al-Qadiri, who was a scholar and saint who was from Morocco originally, and they called themselves Qadiri, and then there was, after that, there was another brotherhood that under Al-Hajj Umar that was identified with another brotherhood that in some ways was similar, but definitely recognized as being different, that was associated with the Tijaniya. And then there was yet a third one that was associated with people who considered they were following a mystical leader that was known in Islam as the Mahdi. The Mahdi was the religious leader that was going to come at the time to purge the world of injustice before the establishment of a heavenly regime. So each one of these brotherhoods had its own rationale, its own justification, its leadership that wrote extensively about how it was different and purer and better than previous ones and anybody else. And, but all of these leaders, right down until many of the leaders even in the Mahdiya movement, were connected with the Fulbe, the ethnic group Fulbe. This is a picture of what happened in the interior of Nigeria and so on. Ashanti remained pretty much the same, but almost all of the rest of the region was transformed. Borno was much smaller in size because it lost a number of the wars, and the emergence of a caliphate that was centered at the city of Sokoto, that had been founded by a leadership under initially Usman Danfodio, and resulted in the formation of what we refer to as the Sokoto Caliphate. Just to give you some idea of what things looked like at the time and what was going on, um, the main pattern of warfare was centered on the control of horses and, to a lesser extent, camels, which allow cavalries and allow raiding, and so that if you control all the horses and all the camels, then you really can control the battlefield. And the only defense against this are massive walls around cities and towns. This one showing a section of the Kano city walls, and one of the gates. There were 13 gates into the city of Kano, which is one of the largest cities. And it shows it's made out of mud brick. And when there's the heavy rains for a couple of months of the year, it means that these walls have to be repaired every year in order to keep them as strong and as massive as possible. So that one of the features of the government was, in fact, the maintenance of these walled towns for protection, and the maintenance of control of horses and camels, so that you had a cavalry force that could be used in warfare. One feature of all of this is that when the European conquest came, the Europeans came with machine guns and mortars that could blow holes through these walls, and machine guns that could knock anybody off any horse. And so that the European conquest was quite fast because of the technological advantage. But during the Jihad movement itself, it was the building of walled towns and cities and the control of horses that made all the difference in terms of who won and who lost. Here are two pictures showing the horses and showing the types of armor that the cavalrymen would wear to protect themselves from bows and arrows. There were relatively few guns in the interior of Africa until towards the end of the 19th century. And then when the guns came, they were not the best guns in relation to the firepower of the Europeans who came shortly thereafter and quite easily conquered the region. Another feature of the Jihad movement and this type of military confrontation was the establishment of fortified communities on the frontiers of the states. And they're known in Arabic as Ribati, or in Hausa as Ribats, and they were walled towns and walled cities and fortifications that were consciously established by the state to consolidate political and geographical control of areas. And this one you see is Werno, which is north of Katsina, north of Sokoto, and which was built by Muhammad Bello, who was the second ruler of the Sokoto Caliphate, and who was the son of Usman Danfodio, the founder. And here you get an idea of the mosques that exist, this one being the central mosque in Kano. Massive, again, mud brick buildings, because there is no building stone and there's no lumber of a type that you can make other types of architectural structures out of, so that mud brick becomes the medium of construction. This is the Kano City Central Mosque. which unfortunately, for historical purposes at least, was destroyed by the Emir of Kano, Abdullahi, in the 1930s, and the modern current mosque in Kano was built in its place, so that unfortunately this historic mosque no longer exists. Some more pictures of how substantial the walled cities were. These walled cities, they had to be maintained every year, as I've indicated. This one, you can tell it's not being maintained because the picture's taken after the British conquest, and the British stopped repairing them immediately and didn't want them repaired. And in many cases, all these walls have washed away to nothing 100 years later, except in some rare instances where sections have been preserved for historical purposes. In front of these walls, needless to say, there's a moat in which during the rainy season you can't get across because there's a lot of water in it. During the dry season, when the water dries up, what's in those big trenches are bushes with thick thorns so that you can't get through them. So that it's really quite an impressive, massive system of defense that was what was developed and maintained. The way it was maintained was through a taxation, basically. Every year, all the adult males in the city had to work, for a certain number of days on repairing sections of the wall. If you were wealthy, your slaves did the work. You didn't actually go there and do it yourself. If you were just an average person, you had to spend time on the wall every dry season. And if you were slaves, of course, you had to do it anyway. Here, an example of 4 Muslims from this region who ended up in Brazil as slaves because they slipped through the net and ended up in slavery nonetheless and sold to Christians nonetheless, even despite the ban. I'm showing it because of the significance of the facial scarification patterns that you see here. What you don't see are the patterns on their chests and backs as well. And these scarifications are indications of ethnicity, of towns people are from, occupations. Usually the parents of these people had when the children were young and given scarification. And at the time, they had an important function. One of the functions was that if you lived in an area of West Africa, you knew what these scarifications meant. You could read them like a road map. When people get to the Americas, they don't have any significance anymore. And therefore, in the literature on slavery in America, they're usually just referred to as country marks or marks of their nation. But in West Africa, they had very specific meaning, and they were an important mechanism for identifying somebody who was a freeborn Muslim, and therefore should not be enslaved. And if by accident or even design somebody ended up being enslaved in a war or something, it meant that it was possible to identify them. And if you could identify them, it meant that you could get in touch with relatives or the town they came from, and somebody would come forward with money to rescue them from slavery and protect them, and hence pay their ransom. And it was always better to allow someone like these men here that you see to be ransomed rather than to sell them as a slave. The reason being is that the price of ransoming somebody was usually about twice the cost of what one would get if they sold them as a slave. So if you were really after money, you'd ransom the person because you get twice as much money rather than just selling them as a slave. So there was a big debate in the Jihad states as to whether the government had the responsibility to free people who were wrongfully enslaved, that is, who had these types of marks, or was it their relatives? And in almost all cases, you won't be surprised. In the end, it turned out to be relatives had to do it, and the state didn't do it. Here is a, a map of the area around Kano City, which was the most important city in the Sokoto Caliphate. It was an extremely densely populated region going 50, 60, 70 kilometers out from Kano City, with perhaps as many as 100 towns, walled towns in that region. Uh, and so that you can see that this was quite densely inhabited. What you can't see on the map is probably half the population, maybe even more, were people who were enslaved, were victims of the Jihad and victims of annual raids into non-Muslim or areas that were considered enemy territory, and were brought back as slaves and then either subsequently sold across the Sahara, but more often were just either redistributed among the aristocracy and the military, or sold on the open market in places like in any of those towns, but especially in Kano, the city itself. Uh, and so that you had a substantial enslaved population, um, and which only elaborates on my point that actually you see relatively few Muslims in the Americas, while in this area you see a lot of people who are enslaved. And one of the features of slavery in these Islamic areas is people weren't Muslims, all of the encouragement and the incentives uh, meant that people who were enslaved became Muslims or practiced Islam. You could not gain your freedom, your emancipation, unless you were a, a devout Muslim. And therefore, all the incentives for the enslaved population was to become Muslim. Uh, this is a picture of the city of Kano in about 1850, which was the largest city in the Sokoto Caliphate. During the dry season, population could swell as high as 60, 70,000 people. Uh, and this is taken from, there are two relatively small hills in Kano. This is taken from Dala Hill, showing the extent of the city, the nature of it. Another feature of the Islamic states was the importance of the textile industry. The growing of cotton in rural areas. The type of cotton was different from the type of cotton in the American South, but nonetheless it was cotton. It was a cotton that grew on a bush, and the bush could keep producing cotton for 3, 4 years before it started producing less cotton. And so what they would do then is tear up the cotton and plant new cotton. But they could use the same plants for several years in a row. This shows an area where there are maybe 50 to 60 dye pits. These dye pits go down. They're for indigo dyeing, for turning cloth blue, and in fact even black, because some of the cloth that was dyed so heavily blue and then had indigo beaten into it, so that it ended up being black rather than blue. And these go down like 3 meters into the ground. They're lined with a cement that is made by the residue of the dyeing process itself, so that they could be, uh, so that they really could be used extensively year after year. And I would call this a factory. The only reason this doesn't look like a factory is because you don't see a roof over it. But you see the numbers of workers, you see the buildings behind are actually beating houses. That's where the workers sit inside and they beat indigo with gigantic wooden mallets. They beat the indigo into the cloth, uh, and making such a fine sheen, high quality textile. It's what the Tuareg nomads in the desert use as veils around their face. And the quality of the cloth is comparable to a very high priced Indian muslin. Uh, and Here you see the cloth being pulled out, dyed indigo. Here you see the types of textiles that they made. These are men's clothing with elaborate Islamic designs, which are dyed and then with tailors sewing silk and other things into them for different patterns. And here you see women's cloths, the same. You see how unbelievably well developed the textile industry was. In Kano alone, that map that I showed you with all the towns around it, in that area, within about a 40-kilometer radius of Kano City, you find perhaps 50,000 textile workers by the middle of the 19th century. So that it's extremely interesting in these areas with so much economic development, such a reliance on slavery, that the parallels with what was happening in the Americas stand out very remarkably. So that's a brief overview of the Jihad movement, where it struck, what it did, and some of the consequences of that movement in the 19th century.